Kitchen Nightmares USA, a show we all know and love for the drama, the chaos, Gordon Ramsay's creative insults,
It's drier than Mark's personality.
and the part where he goes sticking his hand into vats of questionable rotting substances. Each episode follows the same formula. We're introduced to a struggling restaurant, the owners can't work out why the business is failing, Gordon Ramsay arrives to sample the usually gross food, he observes how the place is run, diagnoses the problem, gives the place a makeover, and helps the business get back on its feet. There have been plenty of standout episodes and business owners featured over the original run of the show from 2007 to 2014. One of the most infamous episodes is Amy's Baking Company, the only time Gordon wasn't able to actually help fix the place. This episode went viral, and Amy and Sammy even went on to appear on Dr. Phil and remain two of the most recognizable characters from the series we all love to hate. What if I told you there was a group of people who appeared on Kitchen Nightmares who were so much more dysfunctional, so much more toxic, with an even shadier background than the folks from Amy's Baking Company? Burger Kitchen stands out because not only was there so much drama that 2 episodes were needed to cover everything, but because it wasn't the usual clueless owner bickering with a bumbling chef. Burger Kitchen's failures were the result of a deep rift between father and son, generational trauma, and a family history of fraud and even murder. In today's video, we're going to recap the 2 episodes, then we'll deep dive into how Burger Kitchen came to be, what I thought was just a particularly dramatic installment of one of my favorite background shows, led me down a wild rabbit hole, and trust me, we're not going to be able to guess where this story will take us. The Burger Kitchen was featured in episodes 6 and 7 of season 5, originally airing in November 2011. We meet owners Abe Saffron and his wife Jen. Alan is Australian and a self-professed meat lover and expert, and he wants to bring delicious Aussie Wagyu beef burgers to LA. Alan explains that he inherited $250,000 from his father and used that money to open the Burger Kitchen. It's only been open for about 16 months, but it's losing $5,000 to $6,000 a month. In that time, Alan changed the menu countless times and cycled through 10 chefs and 20 servers. Alan can't work out why the restaurant isn't successful. He blames the restaurant review website Yelp, believing there is some conspiracy against him and 5-star reviews are being deleted. Alan then reveals that he needed some extra money to make his burger dreams come true. So instead of saving up for a bit or getting a loan from the bank, he decided to take a further $250,000 from his son Daniel's share of the inheritance, without Daniel's knowledge. He eventually told his son, who was then effectively forced into the business and forced to work alongside his father. Daniel deeply resents his father, not only for taking his money, but also because his father refuses to treat him like an equal business partner.
My son has a great deal of resentment towards me, and I don't know why.
Also in the mix is executive chef David Blaine and Daniel's girlfriend Wendy, but nobody gets along. Daniel can't forgive his father for taking his money. Alan and Jen are too proud or in denial and can't admit they've done anything wrong. Alan and Jen blame Chef David for the bad food. Chef David is aware the food sucks and hates the food he has to cook, but not as much as he hates his employers. He especially hates Jen and keeps telling her to get on Prozac. Daniel feels he's the only one trying to keep the business afloat and is on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Alan and Jen both hate Daniel's girlfriend Wendy because she tries to stand up to them. So following the usual Kitchen Nightmares formula, Gordon meets the team and gets a quick rundown on the background of the restaurant. He samples some of the food and unsurprisingly hates it all. The burgers are bland, greasy, and incorrectly cooked. The most baffling dish to me was the Australian meat pie. It looked nothing like what a meat pie is meant to look like, and I genuinely question whether Alan has ever had a meat pie. Gordon then confronts everyone, trying to understand how the restaurant went so downhill so quickly. Jen and Chef David quickly launch into a round of blame game, resulting in an all-time Kitchen Nightmares quote.
Mushrooms are important to me. I'm from Poland.
Chef David reveals he hasn't been paid for his work, leading to an incredible response from Alan.
He has been working on the spirit of getting paid. The spirit.
It all gets very heated and very personal. Gordon puts an end to the arguing and sends Chef David out to get ingredients so he can cook a burger his own way. Meanwhile, Gordon pays a visit to son Daniel at his apartment. We also meet Daniel's girlfriend Wendy, who appears to have been hiding behind a curtain. Daniel airs out his frustrations about his father. He's understandably very upset about the money, but also resents the fact that he isn't respected as a business partner. Alan never tells anyone when he makes a menu change or staffing change, and he also refuses to formally list Daniel as a co-owner. Daniel says he's pleaded many times to get his name on the books, but all his father did was slap him in the face with a worthless, unofficial printout. This segment really showed how badly Daniel had been reduced to a shell of a person. He's depressed, defeated, he feels betrayed by his father, and he's probably mourning the future he could have had with the $250,000 that was stolen from him. Back at the restaurant, Chef David has been preparing his own freshly made burger, while Alan has cooked up one of his Wagyu patties, or as he calls it,
With the Wagyu. A what? With the Wagyu.
Gordon says Alan's burger is hideous. Chef David then presents his burger, which predictably Gordon loves. Gordon offers Jen to have a taste, and her reaction is priceless.
What is that strong taste that I'm tasting?
Grilled cheese.
So now that Gordon has proven that the problems with the Burger Kitchen don't lie with Chef David's skills, he turns his focus on how Alan and Jen run things. Alan orders in pre-made frozen beef patties, which are nasty and dry, and he doesn't allow the staff to stray away from his menu and recipes. He and Jen are also too stubborn to admit that their food is bad and want to blame everything and everyone else. It all gets a bit too much for Jen, who walks out, frustrated that Chef David's rude attitude isn't being addressed. Meanwhile, Alan, instead of getting up to see why his wife is upset, stays back and chows down on his gross burger patty. The restaurant starts preparing for dinner service, so Gordon can observe how things normally operate. Alan pulls Gordon aside and presents him with a book he wrote about his life and his relationship with his own father. The show glosses over the fact that Alan's father, Abe Saffron, was actually one of the most notorious crime bosses in Australian history. It also turns out that there was quite a lot of other information that Alan was withholding from the show. Don't worry, we'll get into all of it very soon. Alan confides to Gordon that he left Australia after refusing to get involved with his father's business, for reasons that will soon become very clear. He says his father was a controlling man and he was tired of living under his thumb, so he started a new life in the United States, and their relationship pretty much ended after that.
How can you love someone who stabbed you so much in the back? And to think that a father would do that to his own son.
Controlling father, resentful son. Does this situation sound a little familiar? As expected, dinner service is a disaster. Everyone butts heads, no one listens to each other, and the food is bad. We learn that Alan has bad breath, and miscommunication leads to chaos and threats of physical violence. Daniel fires Chef David, who then comes back demanding a check for $1,000. The ensuing argument is so insane that Gordon, who is usually the one yelling, is literally lost for words. I think he knows at this point that he's bitten off way more than he can chew. Chef David keeps telling Jen she needs to be on Prozac, then he calls them all crackheads and meth heads. Daniel agrees to give $1,000 of his own money, but then his girlfriend Wendy gets involved, snatching the check out of Jen's hands, which leads Alan to yell at her with his stinky breath. Poor Daniel has a full-on breakdown. Can you blame him?
And David, for the record, I'm not on Prozac, dear.
But for the record, you should be.
In the next segment, it's the following morning and Gordon has invited the Saffron family and the restaurant staff to a local theatre. Real Yelpers gather on stage along with a Yelp employee to explain to Alan that there is no conspiracy against him and they all had legitimate reasons for leaving negative reviews of Burger Kitchen. We learn that Alan really has it out for Yelpers and has sent aggressive replies back to many negative reviewers, and even threatened to report one person to the hate crime division of the LAPD. Jen saw this as a good time to take a nap and is shown yawning and dozing off. This segment is a bit odd and long-winded, but by the end, Alan seemed to accept that there was no coordinated effort to ruin his restaurant via Yelp. Now that Alan was over Yelp, it was time to tackle the main problem with the Burger Kitchen. The extreme tension between everyone, and the fact that nobody could agree on how the restaurant should be run. Gordon plays family therapist in this segment, trying to work out the broken trust between father and son. Obviously, Daniel has zero trust in his father ever since his father took $250,000 from him without permission. Wendy also jumps in and accuses Alan and Jen of paying themselves a salary while leaving Daniel with no income from the restaurant. Once again, there's screaming and shouting and name-calling, causing Daniel to break down again, and he begs his parents to simply take accountability, admit their wrongdoing, and try to get along with his girlfriend Wendy. I really do feel for Daniel. He's only 29 years old during the time of filming. He should be out there living his best life, building his career or whatever it is he wants to do. But instead, he's been forced into this miserable situation, dealing with not only massive financial pressures, but also some of the most toxic parents ever featured on the show. Gordon then pulls out Alan's book. He says he stayed up till 4 a.m. reading it and points out that the current situation in front of him was paralleling Alan's experience with his own scummy father.
Oh, the way you describe your father, it's exactly the way Daniel would describe you, and I'm sorry to tell you this.
Gordon calling out Alan for behaving exactly like his own father seemed to be the much-needed wake-up call, and for the first time, Alan owns up to his wrongdoing and apologizes. Cue the uplifting music and everything, but in all honesty, neither Daniel or Wendy look too convinced. Next, Gordon gives the kitchen staff a crash course in cooking a burger properly before dinner service begins. Things go well at first. Daniel seems invigorated by the family meeting and is excited for change. However, things quickly fall into disarray once again, with the messy ticketing system and bad communication confusing the cooks. Alan then wanders into the kitchen, which annoys the shit out of Daniel, and Gordon urges him to take a back seat. Another big element of the Kitchen Nightmares formula is the makeover. Gordon has a team come in to redesign and revamp the restaurant, and a few days later, the new and improved burger kitchen is unveiled to the team. Everyone's moved to tears. They love it so much, but I don't know. Some of the wall art is not the most visually pleasing, and they've brought in these yellow benches that look very uncomfortable. The makeover isn't exactly to 2024 tastes, but I guess it's an improvement. And I have to commend Daniel for his excellent self-awareness here.
I honestly feel that this place has urban street appeal. I sound like a tool saying that, but that's the industry. You have to look hip and you have to look cool.
Gordon also unveils a brand new point-of-sale system and hands out iPod touches to the overjoyed servers, peak 2011. He then shows everyone the brand new menu and makes Alan vow that he won't make any changes. Everyone tries the food and loves it, including Jen, who doesn't choke on the strong flavors this time. It's now relaunch night. Gordon drops a bombshell. He's invited a whole bunch of, quote, serious bloggers and Yelpers to come try the new food. The stakes are high. Daniel does a great job expediting this important dinner service. The burgers are being sent to tables of bloggers and Yelpers in a timely and organized manner. Alan is relegated to staying out of the way behind the bar. However, he gets bored of that and starts mingling with the customers and nagging the kitchen, causing Daniel to lose focus, and as a result, incorrectly cooked burgers are sent out. Gordon delivers a signature line.
It's raw!
Alan is once again banished to the bar. Daniel regains control of the kitchen, and the night finishes on a high note. Gordon urges Alan and Jen to allow Daniel to take the reins and take over running the restaurant. They enthusiastically agree. Gordon then pulls Daniel aside for a one-on-one chat. He shares with Daniel that one of his biggest regrets in life is that he didn't get to make amends with his own father before he passed. Gordon advises Daniel to try and forgive his father and move on. He then tells Daniel that he believes in him. It's a touching moment that feels very genuine and just goes to show how much of an emotional rollercoaster this episode truly was, and how deeply the conflict ran. Unfortunately, the Burger Kitchen changed hands in August 2011, then closed down for good in February 2012, only a few months after its episodes aired. In April 2020, Abe Saffron died of a heart attack, aged 71. While watching these episodes, there were definitely a couple of glaring unanswered questions. How did Grandpa Saffron have over $500,000 to leave his son and grandson? What on earth had happened between Alan and his father that drove him to write a whole book? Earlier I alluded to the fact that Alan's father, Abe Saffron, was one of Australia's most notorious crime bosses. What we saw in Kitchen Nightmares barely even skimmed the surface of the full story of the Saffron family. So let's start at the beginning. Who exactly was Abe Saffron? Abraham Gilbert Saffron was born in October 1919. He grew up in the working class inner west suburbs of Sydney, where his parents owned a drapery business. He joined the Merchant Navy in 1940, where he started a side hustle providing alcohol, cigarettes, and other contraband to the sailors. He was also a bookmaker and made a small fortune, although he always told people he made nothing to avoid paying taxes. After the war, Abe became a co-owner of the Roosevelt Club in King's Cross in Sydney. At the time, there were strict restrictions on alcohol, post-war rationing, price caps, plus venues had to stop selling alcohol after 6 p.m. Abe and many other club and pub owners at the time ignored these rules and would simply continue selling alcohol discreetly at inflated prices after 6 p.m. and would pay police officers to turn a blind eye. The Roosevelt Club was a huge success. It became one of the most glamorous venues in Sydney and attracted high-class clientele, introducing Abe to powerful businessmen, politicians, lawyers, and judges. Abe was by all accounts a very charming man. He was a good listener with a sharp memory who made everyone he chatted with feel important. One fact about him that was brought up a lot was how he always took time to visit all the tables and converse with the guests. Perhaps this is why Alan constantly felt the need to mingle with customers at the Burger Kitchen. In 1947, Abe married hairdresser Doreen Krantz, who took charge over all the choreography and costumes at the Roosevelt. Doreen's family had tried to talk her out of marrying Abe, but she chose to follow her heart. And of course, she had no idea how much agony he would eventually bring into her life. Their son Alan was born in 1949. Abe used his profits to purchase more and more venues in King's Cross. At the time, only one hotel or pub license was allowed per person, so Abe used other people's names to buy up multiple licenses. He sold alcohol illegally out of these venues, and also started to run brothels and illegal gambling dens, although Abe himself never gambled, as there was nothing he hated more than losing money. Abe ran his businesses with an iron fist. As he grew wealthier, he also started building up an immense property portfolio. Not only did he own half of the brothels, nightclubs, hotels, and illegal casinos in King's Cross, but he also came to own most of the new properties in the rapidly expanding precinct, and helped shape the Cross into the iconic red light district it would eventually be known for. He became known as Mr. Sin and the King of the Cross. He also began to expand his operations into more legitimate enterprises, and at the height of his prominence in the mid-1970s, Abe was involved in over 100 companies around Australia. In his pocket, through bribery and blackmail, were local cops and politicians, New South Wales police commissioners, the New South Wales Premier, Supreme Court judges, and the Attorney General of Australia. He was powerful and untouchable. Abe was also infamous for his personal life. He was a very controlling man who didn't do a good job of hiding his many extramarital affairs, which naturally caused major emotional distress to his long-suffering wife Doreen, and by extension, his son Alan. Who knows if Gordon Ramsay actually read Alan's book Gentle Satan, but if he did, I have no doubt that he would have realized that he was way out of his depth trying to deal with this family's issues. Prior to the book's launch, Alan told the media that he had received death threats and that copies of his unedited manuscript had been handed in to police in Australia and California in case he was met with foul play. He claimed to be in possession of secretly taken photographs and films of high-ranking police officers and politicians behaving badly that his father had used against them as blackmail. Alan's publishers advised him to leave out the names of any corrupt high-profile individuals and hired bodyguards to attend his public appearances. All of this could have been made up as a marketing ploy, but it's still fascinating to contrast this version of Alan, the son of a ruthless underworld boss, with the so-called burger connoisseur we see on Kitchen Nightmares. Gentle Satan, published in 2009, gets its title from Doreen's nickname for Abe. From the book, it's clear Alan's relationship with his father was very complicated. As a kid, Alan enjoyed accompanying his well-respected father everywhere. He loved his father and was proud of him, but he also knew that his father wasn't faithful to his mother, and it caused her to become very depressed. Abe had many short flings with the dancers at his clubs, but he fell in love with one of them, Rita Hagenfeld's, and she became more than just a mistress. They ended up staying together for 20 years. It was no secret either. Abe bought Rita her own house and he would throw parties there and spend 3 nights a week at her place. When Rita gave birth to their daughter Melissa, Abe became even more focused on his second family. The disrespect, the hurt, the public humiliation, it all became too much for Doreen, who was driven to 3 suicide attempts through pill overdoses. and it was a teenaged Alan who would have to pick up the pieces. Definitely makes you wonder how Chef David Blaine's constant jabs about Jen and Prozac made Alan feel. Alan was good with numbers, so after high school he worked with his father, helping with the accounting, and was even tasked with counting money for bribes and packing them into envelopes. Alan had good business sense and successfully ran his father's vending machine company at age 20. He was living it up. He was cashed up and partied almost every night at his father's clubs, always flanked by girls. He also started hanging out in his father's casinos, even though Abe strongly disapproved of gambling, but because he never really had to worry about losing money, he got hooked. However, Alan's partying came to an abrupt end at age 22. In one of the more disturbing chapters of the book, Alan details how he was detained by police one night out of the blue and sent to a psychiatric hospital for drug addiction, despite the fact that he never even smoked cigarettes, let alone did drugs. He pleaded and protested to his parents that he wasn't on drugs, but the police had a file on him, plus some pills they say they found on him. This was the early 70s, and Alan was subjected to 3 days of excruciating electroshock therapy and strong sedatives. He was even scheduled for a lobotomy until he managed to phone his mother and she was able to get him released. Alan was left with permanent hearing damage, and the matter was never spoken about in his family. Alan later discovered that the whole thing had been set up by his father, who knew there were no drugs but felt that Alan's gambling and partying had gotten out of hand and wanted to put an end to it. A year after this incident, Alan got married to his first wife, Susie. Their relationship was doomed from the start. Susie didn't do a good job of hiding that she was still seeing some other guy named Martin, and she seemed to be more interested in her father-in-law Abe than husband Alan. There were many rumors in their circles that their 3 sons were not Alan's biological kids. Alan himself believes that there is a chance that his own father might have gotten his wife pregnant, which is just insane to suspect, and I can't imagine the kind of trust issues Alan must have had. To distract himself from his failing marriage, Alan poured himself into work, opening up successful venues of his own and developing business relations with record companies in LA. By the end of the 70s, Alan had had enough of Susie and planned to file for divorce, hoping to start a new life in the United States. His parents were strongly opposed to divorce, and Abe even suggested to Alan to stay married and just get a mistress. Alan went through with filing, and to his dismay, his father sided with Susie and paid for a top divorce lawyer for her. Alan had been traveling to the United States more and more frequently for business and to get away from the bullshit back home. It was at this point that Alan meets Jen in New York. It was honestly quite bizarre to read about a young Alan and young Jen meeting and falling in love after watching them on Kitchen Nightmares. It's hard to imagine Alan courting Jen, buying her $500 bouquets of flowers, taking her to the most exclusive restaurants and bars in the city. Let's fast forward a bit now. Alan and Susie's divorce is finalized. He starts a new life in America. His parents practically disown him and side with Susie. Susie takes their 3 sons to Israel to live with her boyfriend Martin, who turns out to be physically abusive to the kids. It's all very messy and unpleasant, but Alan eventually wins full custody and the kids move back to Sydney to live with Abe and Doreen. Alan and Jen officially marry and have 2 kids, Rebecca and Daniel. The birth of the 2 new grandkids repairs Alan's relationship with his parents. Susie is never heard from again. Alan has a string of business successes and failures through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Abe Saffron dies in September 2006, and there is a public battle over his money. In January 2010, Alan Saffron opens up the Burger Kitchen. Gordon Ramsay was right, this was a compelling read, and if you're finding this video compelling so far, please give it a like and make sure you're subscribed. In Gentle Satan, Alan also spills about his father's involvement in 2 of the darkest chapters in Sydney history. Juanita Joan Nielsen was an Australian journalist, heiress, and model who disappeared in 1975. She used her newspaper to publicise and voice her opposition to a multi-million-dollar property development project in King's Cross, as well as expose the various bribes that were flowing out of the offices of Abe Saffron. She was last seen at the Carousel Club, a nightclub owned by Abe Saffron. The meeting had been arranged under false pretenses, and Juanita was never seen again. 2 men who worked at the Carousel Club were convicted of conspiracy to kidnap. However, no charges were laid over Juanita's actual disappearance. It was determined that she had been murdered, although her body and killer were never found. The case remained unsolved for decades, and it became a source of public interest and speculation. but Alan claimed in his book that it was indeed one of his father's club managers, James Big Jim Anderson, who was known for his violent and volatile nature, who murdered Juanita Nielsen. Another tragedy that Abe Saffron was linked to was the Luna Park fire that killed 6 children and 1 adult. Luna Park is an amusement park and Sydney landmark. In June 1979, a fire broke out inside the Ghost Train ride. 35 people were trapped on the ride. Most were able to escape, however the park was short-staffed. The fire hoses couldn't reach the whole ride and the water pressure was too low. And an hour later, the entire ride had been demolished. 7 bodies were recovered. The fire was initially believed to have been started by faulty electrical wiring or a discarded cigarette or match, but an official cause was never established. Then in 2007, Anne Buckingham, Abe Saffron's niece, told the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper that her uncle had ordered the fire in an effort to gain control of Luna Park's lease. Abe had been linked to 7 other arson cases in the past. It was one of his strategies as a property developer. If for some reason he couldn't legitimately develop a property, he'd simply set fire to it so he could buy it or renovate it. In his book, Alan denies his father had anything to do with the fire. In 2021, the ABC aired a 3-part investigative series about the Ghost Train fire and concluded that Abe Saffron had ordered some bikies to set the fire but never intended for anyone to die. The program claimed that the New South Wales Premier and a High Court judge were then paid to cover it up during the inquest. A fresh inquest was launched shortly after the program aired, but as of December 2024, no findings have yet been released to the public. Over the span of Abe Saffron's 60-year crime career, he only went to jail once for tax fraud, largely because his former club manager James Big Jim Anderson testified against him, telling the investigation about how Abe's clubs kept 2 sets of accounts. In 1988, Abe was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but ended up only doing 17 months. His time behind bars was full of special perks and privileges. He even arranged for one of his drag shows, Les Girls, to perform at the prison. Shortly before Abe's release, Big Jim Anderson relocated to the Philippines. By the late 90s, Abe had sold off the majority of his property portfolio. He died in September 2006, age 86. The total value of Abe's estate was estimated to be worth anywhere between $25 to $100 million. It was reported that the bulk of Abe's estate went to his secretary turned long-term partner, Teresa Tkachek and Melissa Hagenfelds. Both women received a lifetime annuity of $1,000 per week, plus properties in some of Australia's most expensive neighbourhoods. Abe's 8 grandchildren, Alan's 5 children and Melissa's 3 children were left $1 million each, which is obviously a whole lot more than the $250,000 Daniel says he got on Kitchen Nightmares. Alan himself was left a comparatively low amount of $500,000. Abe's will stipulated that if Alan contested the will, he was to receive nothing. The rest of Abe's money was split between his long-term staff, friends, and charities. Alan publicly expressed his disappointment and bitterness about his share of the inheritance. Over the next few years, he would engage in several legal battles for a larger slice since he was, quote, the only legitimate heir, referring to the fact that his father's philandering resulted in a couple of half-siblings. Alan's dissatisfaction about his share of the inheritance could also explain why he felt entitled to take $250,000 of his son Daniel's money. 5 years after Abe Saffron's death, his family appeared on Kitchen Nightmares, and the deep fracture between Alan Saffron and his son Daniel suddenly makes a lot more sense. Gentle Satan ends with Alan grappling with the idea of forgiving his father. It's actually quite sad that he ended up repeating the cycle with Daniel, and I genuinely hope they were able to make amends before he died. Shortly before filming Kitchen Nightmares, Alan was also featured in an episode of the documentary series Australian Families of Crime. It was super interesting to watch this side of Alan in his interview segments. He's dressed smartly and talks about Abe with what can only be described as pride, even as he's describing his father shooting a rival venue owner at point-blank range. On Kitchen Nightmares, Alan had boasted about how celebrities loved his burgers. Turns out, he was not lying. Before he suffered a stroke in December 2010, Alan ran a successful movie studio and talent management agency. He helped launch Denzel Washington's career, and his clients included Robert Downey Jr. at one point, as well as Jigsaw himself, Tobin Bell. Alan clearly had solid business acumen, and it's a lot clearer now why he opened the burger kitchen and why he chose to run it how he did. One last tidbit, Alan's oldest son David seems to have followed in his grandfather's footsteps. In 2017, David opened a strip club in LA called Master D's Academy of Sin. Then in 2022, he was charged with wire fraud and money laundering by the United States Department of Justice for stealing $25 million through his Bitcoin Ponzi scheme. He used aliases like Bitcoin Yoda and Blue Wizard and claimed to have created an AI bot that would guarantee a 150% return on investment. When it was time to pay up, he made excuses like a solar flare causing a website malfunction. So that's the full story of the Burger Kitchen. Thanks for coming with me on this crazy journey. I never thought I could get so invested in one of the families featured on Kitchen Nightmares, but here we are. Take care and see you in the next video.